Okay, well, I think we're live. Welcome back, one and all, to our next episode, if you will, our next discussion of the book 500 Years of Protest and Liberty. Let's see if I can get this on camera so you can see it. And the theme that we're exploring through history with the author, Nick Miller, and my good friend and colleague, Edward Woods, is Christian nationalism and the difference between the notion that America was founded as a Christian nation and the Protestant principles that influenced the founding of our nation. It's a very, very important distinction. And I think we may start to get there in this discussion today, because we're first going to start with the influence that Protestant principles had, that Protestantism had on the explosion of literacy and human rights and democracy around the world. Isn't that right, my friend and author and colleague, Professor Nicholas Miller?
Yes, yes, indeed. We're going to start by looking at chapter 5, which raises the question of influence of Western Christianity on colonialism and imperialism around the world. And I think it helps illustrate, you and I were discussing a bit earlier, a theme that we're looking at is that of Christian nationalism. And it's not clear. We need to define that term. And I suggested something to contrast it with, and that is Christian patriotism, right? Is there a difference between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism, being a patriotic Christian? And maybe I'll just ask the question and set it out to the two of you.
Well, Ed, why don't you jump in here and give that a crack? Your concept of Christian nationalism as we see it rearing its head here in America today. You're muted, my friend.
Yeah.
Very dangerous.
I said, let me come off of mute.
Very dangerous to mute the preacher.
I think there's two additional. When we look at Christian nationalism, we're looking primarily focusing on internal politics, such as passing laws that reflect one's views of Christianity and its role in political and social life, where I see patriotism as more of a pledge to Christianity at all costs, even in the face of exploiting others. Both I see as dangerous, in terms of how you do it. Nationalism may be a little bit more palatable than the extreme of patriotism, but I see both of them as dangerous steps as relates to the separation of church and state and what we're seeing here take place in America. Going to Nick's book, we've always believed...
let me just stop you there, Ed, to understand a little better. Do you think a Christian can be patriotic? Do you think a Christian can appropriately be patriotic? Is patriotism something that a Christian can engage in or support?
I guess part of the concern, and let's just talk about the Star Spangled Banner. Let's talk about the protests surrounding the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, it all depends on how you define patriotism. Everyone's real clear in the third stanza of the Star Spangled Banner. For people like me, there's some confusion and some concern with regards to when the song was being written, was it being inclusive of me, who is a Christian but is also African American? And so it really depends on how you define it. And I'm sure people have a variety of different definitions with regards to that. I'm a little leery because I'm not sure which definition people are asking me to sign off on as relates to that.
I think that's a good point. I think if a Christian patriotism could be defined as blind allegiance or unquestioning loyalty to one's country. And I think in that definition that really a Christian shouldn't be blindly patriotic. But I think that many people understand patriotism simply as an appreciation for the positive things in one's country, that it's not blind, that the best kinds of patriots can criticize their countries by holding them up to the standards of the country. And I think that when I think about the distinction between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism, Christian nationalism tends to want to baptize the nation in Christian identity and beliefs, whereas Christian patriotism is just a recognition that, you know, God sets up the boundaries of countries in some ways and sets up leaders of countries. Doesn't mean we should be blindly loyal to them, but it does mean we can have an appreciation for our home, for our communities, and that we can be patriotic in the best sense of the word. So I would say that a Christian patriotism is something that we can at least cautiously, if carefully defined, support and embrace. Whereas what this program is mainly criticizing and targeting is this Christian nationalism, where we attempt to baptize the whole nation in the clothes of Christianity. I don't know, Alan.
I'm gonna come down maybe a little more pragmatic, but somewhere between the two of you, I suspect, because on the one hand, look, to me, patriotism simply means love of country. Okay, I have not traveled abroad extensively. I have a little bit. I love America. I live in California. I love the West, Utah, the canyons, the Grand Canyon, Arizona, going to Hawaii. I mean, I love our country. So to me, that is the positive part of patriotism, simply to love one's nation. And there's nothing wrong with that. The same token, when I think about how our nation has behaved, and I'm looking here at Edward and thinking, how have we treated immigrants, African Americans, Native Americans throughout our history? I think that in Revelation 13, the picture of the United States in that prophecy is a picture of a controversy, a conflict between the Lamb and the dragon. And in the Greek tense of that, it's the imperfect tense, which means that this conflict has been going on from the beginning and it's still not complete. And so we have this tension in American history between these glorious principles of freedom and equality and justice for all, right? And that's the Lamb, our First Amendment and our Bill of Rights and all of that. Those are the very positive aspects that we associate with being lamb-like or Christian. And then we have, the darker side of our own indulgence in imperialism, of the Cherokee Trail of Tears and Jim Crow laws and slavery and, on and on. So, if we're going to be honest, our whole experience as America, it's been a mixed bag. But I think, with you, Nick, love of country has to also be honest about not only our positive attributes, but our flaws. And as Protestants, we are called, to condemn injustice and to call the society to a higher standard, to a higher moral standard, not just in a religious sense, but in a justice sense. So to me, and I know it's a little bit of a long-winded answer, Christian nationalism, on the other hand, would make a preferred place for the Christian faith in our country, believes that our country was founded by God to be explicitly Christian, and would essentially permit discrimination against those who are non-Christian. This is for and there's a large racist strain running through modern day Christian nationalism, that this is really a nation of, by, and for European white Christians, which there was a time when that was defined in terms of Northern European. It would not have included Southern European, would not have included Catholics, would not have included Italians and Irish and Poles and what have you. But, you know, the boundaries change a little bit over the course of time.
Well, we're talking about
as a-
America. Go ahead, Edward. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say as a follow-up, you know, I see Christian nationalism more of a move of the Christian right, more religious in nature. And I see Christian patriotism, especially over the last 5 years, more of a secular movement, make America great again, true patriots. I would see more Christian patriotism and the patriot attacks when we look at Colin Kaepernick. You know, that I would see that, you know, he's not a true patriot, was the suggestion. He's not a true lover of American ideals, but yet when he took a knee, he did it out of respect. And after consulting with a veteran who fought, you know, in America's wars, I'm just saying the terminology patriotism, as you define it, Nick, is more palatable to me as relates to a love of American. But what has transpired over these last 5 years, you know, obviously in the context of your book, you know, it has, how can I say, so many different definitions that I think the term patriot has been exploited and
Yeah.
commandeered by whoever wants to own the definition. Whereas I can no longer wholesale agree whether or not I want to agree with that particular term because of its change over the last 5 years
So,
and what it has meant to people of color.
so I agree with that, but I don't think we should allow a certain extreme group to capture such an important term. I mean, patriot is a very old term. Essentially, Google says a person who vigorously supports their country and is prepared to defend it against enemies or detractors. And surely your example about Colin Kaepernick, for instance, he got his idea about kneeling down from a true patriotic soldier, right, who loves his country and says this is the most effective way of protesting. So I would not want to abandon and just give over the word patriot and patriotic to the more extreme xenophobic expressions of that. I think we want to, as Alan was saying earlier, the true patriot is the person who will criticize his country as falling short, as failing to uphold its ideas and ideals, as America has. But let me use that point to transition to chapter 5. We're not wanting to talk about America initially. We're wanting to talk about how this maybe, and here's an example of Christians being patriotic in criticizing colonial and imperial enterprises that its own countries were engaging in overseas, and through that criticism and critique, using their religious convictions, not to advance Christianity per se, but using their religious convictions to advance basic concepts of justice and fairness. And that's what this chapter 5 is about. I don't know if it came as a surprise to any of you. Obviously, I wrote the chapter, but you're all familiar with the critique that, you know, the Western nations of Europe, the church and state combined and embarked on this imperialistic enterprise, making slaves of much of the world, especially in Africa, and subjugating other nations to the imperial yoke. And Christianity, you know, cooperated in this oppression, and it was used by the state to subjugate and to hold in sway, not just civilly but also religiously, you know, millions of people in foreign lands. That's kind of the story that the secular historians are telling us these days. But this chapter 5 brings out something else, and maybe one of you.
Well, yeah, there's another side to the story, which is the Protestant, as you develop it, Nick, very well, the Protestant commitment to teaching people to have an informed personal relationship with Jesus Christ, the principles of sola scriptura and the priesthood of all believers. These basic principles required the Protestant churches to develop education systems and to teach that the Bible and reading was not just for the elite in society, it was for everybody. And it was really out of the Protestant impulse that you have schools founded throughout the world. And the research that you cite in the chapter is the enormous contribution that Protestant theology, the Protestants, based on this theology, have made to democracy, human rights in more than 100 countries around the world.
So,
But
yeah,
like you
Edward,
said
go ahead.
like you said in your book, you mentioned that Robert Woodbury's groundbreaking article, "The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy," but you showed a strong correlation between nonconformist Protestant missions and the implementation of mass education, mass spreading the rule of law, and the rise of social institutions, which were all necessary building blocks of functioning democracies. What I liked about that was you showed the nonconformist Protestants felt it was necessary to empower people to become educated and think for themselves and have a position for themselves. But that had to happen through mass education. That had to happen through mass printing, the rule of law, the rise of societal institutions, so that they could make a decision what was the best democracy for them at that time. I think that was, for me, one of the strongest things that came out of this chapter in terms of the link to Woodbury, but also the need for critical thinking and how we could not just assume people would have to accept imperialism, accept colonialism, but actually have the ability to think for themselves and then form coalition of like-minded people with regards to how they wanted to be governed. I just thought, for me, that was significant.
Good. That's a very nice summary, and I hope it wasn't lost that Woodbury acknowledges that not all Protestants operated this way, and he draws a distinction between Protestant churches that were nationalist churches, state-established churches, and these churches, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, other churches that worked with the state, did in fact work with the imperialist oppressors, and their efforts did not correlate with the rise of civil rights and democracy. But he talks about the free church Protestants, the dissenting Protestants, those that were opposed to the combination of church and state, those that valued the priesthood of all believers. And it was those churches that did two or three things. First of all, they believed in mass literacy, right? If you're a Catholic church back in those days, it was the priests that needed the knowledge. If you were a hierarchical Episcopal church, again, it was basically the priests and the church leaders that needed education. But if you were a Methodist or you were a Baptist, you believed that everyone needed to read the Bible. And so you tended to provide mass education and mass literacy. And this led to the ability of communities to also function, not just religiously, but also politically, as in their self-interest. And almost without knowing it, these Protestant groups laid the foundations and the seeds for the creation of institutions where the native peoples could participate in publishing activity and political activity and book writing activity. And this then directly led to these groups asserting their self-independence and their autonomy. Now, there's one other point that he makes, and that is that these free church Protestants were also willing to criticize the imperial colonial powers, and that groups of Methodists and Baptists back home in England would actually pressure the parliament to restrain the East India Company in India from its oppressive and abusive practices against the natives. So there's this long history of public engagement. And as Alan said, more than 100 countries, it can be statistically demonstrated a strong correlation between this dissenting church Protestantism and the rise of civil liberties and democracies in all of these countries.
And Nick, the distinction that you're drawing, I've often discussed the two different kinds of roles and functions of the church. So you have the priestly function and the prophetic function. So the high church, the Anglican church, the Catholic church, they were taking more of the priestly, the priestly function, in my concept, is really aligned with the status quo of power. And they are there in part to provide legitimate moral legitimacy for the status quo, for the power structures. They're not there to shake, they're very close to the power structures. So they're very comfortable with a close association between church and state. They're not going to be like Hosea or Amos, standing apart and calling the society to account for their sins. The prophetic function of the church is a function like Hosea or Amos or any one of the prophets that is not aligned with the power structures of the state, but is more committed to the spiritual and moral and social well-being of the people, and is not afraid to speak out. And I think, Adventism in our, first couple of generations, we were far more consistent with that prophetic understanding. We had both the apocalyptic sort of emphasis on, teaching about the nearness of Christ's return and all of our prophetic expectations, but we were also very feet on the ground, committed to bettering society and dealing with social injustice as we saw it, a much more balanced approach.
Edward, it looked like you were going to respond to that.
No, it was an internal conversation. Sorry,
Oh,
I had to go on mute.
But in the context of the influence of Protestantism, as we've been discussing it globally, it's that those churches that were carrying out the prophetic function, right, that were not aligned with power. It was not the high church Anglican. And we have a comment, by the way, that from one of our listeners here, that the French typically would intermarry the native tribal members and evangelize them, while the English, on the other hand, generally would not intermarry or evangelize. I'm thinking that I don't know if the French Protestants were very active outside of France. I know Huguenots in New York, where I'm from, but the French predominantly in their colonial efforts were Catholic, I think, and of course the English were Protestants. But you may have some more insight on that, Nick.
Well, yeah, I just written in the chat. I'm not sure what time period he's talking about, but I think he's right about the Anglican, the official English church did not do much evangelism, though there was the creation of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel that developed in the late 1700s and engaged in missionary outreach to Americans, to Native Americans. And certainly the Methodists and the Baptists engaged in evangelism. So I'm not quite sure where and what time period he's talking about, but maybe he can type further into the chat.
You had both English and American Bible societies founded around the early part of the 1800s as well.
That's right.
Tremendous missionary. I think we would be remiss if we didn't point out that, on the heels of British colonialism and the whole notion of, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire, the English language became a vehicle used by God to bring the gospel to peoples all over the world. So, it's always been kind of a mixed bag, if you will. That's the nature of the human condition. You've got the good and the bad.
Yeah, well, and I hope that this point illustrates, we're talking earlier about Christian nationalism versus Christian patriotism. And I think this is illustrated in these two groups of Protestants earlier on. The Christian nationalists worked with their governments and were part of the colonial oppressor class. The Christian patriots, the free church Protestants, they certainly were proud of being English or Scottish or whatever they were, but they were willing to criticize their governments, and they worked on behalf of, yes, evangelizing the local population, but not baptizing the government and making it, uncriticizable because it was, Christian and religious. No, they criticized it for its injustices. And maybe bringing that back to chapter 6, if we talk about the separation of church and state in America, maybe if I ask this question, true or false, the first settlers of America were strong supporters of religious freedom for everybody. They came to America to establish religious freedom, and it was religious freedom for everybody. True or false?
Is that a trick question?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, but the question reflects the way that, our education system has really dumbed down and kind of almost propagandized American history, lack of nuance. So, I think the story.
Well, who were the first settlers of America? What groups? Give me some group names.
Well, so you had the Spanish coming into Florida. So we're going to go from south to north.
All right.
Right. You had some Brits for commercial purposes who chose some really bad swampland in Virginia.
So you had the Catholics in Florida. St. Augustine is the oldest city in America, and it's settled by Catholics. Jamestown is settled by commercial British, but they're Anglicans. It's the official established Anglican church. Then further north, who do we find further north?
Well, then you get up to Plymouth Rock, which I visited when I was an undergraduate in Boston. And you have the Puritans and the Pilgrims, congregational Calvinist, Protestants who thought that the Protestant Church of England was, heretical, and they wanted a more pure church.
So starting with the Catholics, we don't even really have to ask the question, right? The Catholics in Florida weren't about religious freedom and toleration. In fact, Saint Augustine was originally a Huguenot town settled by fleeing French Protestants, and the Catholics came along and wiped out the Huguenots there and created it as a Catholic town only. No Protestants or anyone else allowed. Yes, very famous.
Okay, but then when you get to Maryland, the Catholics in Maryland had a edict of toleration and had a form of religious freedom there in Maryland.
All right, but you're jumping ahead of the story because that's not settled till the mid 1660s. So we have the Spanish, we have Jamestown, commercial settlement. They didn't settle that for religious freedom. The Anglican Church was the established church. No religious freedom for anyone else. Now our only hope is the Puritans, Mayflower, the Pilgrims. They come for religious freedom, don't they? But
for themselves.
Do they come for religious freedom for all?
No.
Only for the godly and for those that follow the Bible correctly, right? And in fact, what happened to some? Who is really the first one to promote or establish religious freedom in America? And he comes from the Puritan colonies, and Alan's well aware of it.
He was not a pop singer, as some would answer, but Roger Williams was very well connected politically and socially in both in England and here, and remarkably was able to obtain a charter for Rhode Island from the Crown that embraced the separation of church and state and religious freedom for everybody.
And he's actually exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony because he is not an Orthodox Puritan. He has questions about the imposition of religious values by the civil magistrate. And we should be clear, Massachusetts Bay Colony hangs 4 Quakers as late as the mid-17th century.
Well, and let me challenge your use of the term exile, because he fled what he would have been apprehended and returned to England, where he very well may have been hung if he had been caught and sent back to England. So yeah, he fled south, was sheltered by the Narragansett Indians. I believe it was them,
Yep.
one of the Indian tribes. And yes, he was in effect exiled, and they didn't keep coming after him when he left, but he certainly did not leave voluntarily.
So at the beginning of the American colonial experiment, there was establishment, there were people opposed to religious freedom in the southern United States and in the central United States and in the northern United States. And there was one small exception to that, Roger Williams and Rhode Island. But you alluded earlier to another colony a few years later, a few decades later, in the 1650s and 60s and 70s, 2 or 3 other colonies get established that serve as a better foundation for what we think of as American religious freedom. What colonies are those?
Well, you
About the
have
Quakers, Pennsylvania?
right?
Yeah,
You have
Edward,
William
go
Penn.
ahead.
I think he's talking about the Quakers in Pennsylvania, William Penn. And with regards to that, and it's just interesting because if you look at the history of what Nick was talking about, I mean, you see that with the Sons of Liberty, who were behind the Boston Tea Party. I mean, you're seeing that with these religious movements. You're seeing this with the abolition, the forming of abolition. All of this stuff is coming from chapter 5. And you can see how it's making a difference in democracy across the country and how things have incrementally taken place to actually where we are in the 21st century. In particular, with the Quaker movement, and it was definitely further along than what Roger Williams had. But when you really think about the evolution of human rights through the separation of church and state, that was the thing that probably got me the most about the Quaker movement, where Roger Williams was consistent with regards to conscience. I see the Quakers not only consistent with conscience, but also human dignity and rights.
So it's these dissenting Protestant groups, much as what happened internationally. The Quakers, Roger Williams became a Baptist. The dissenting Protestants laid the foundations in the middle colonies. Maryland, New Jersey was a Quaker colony. Delaware split off New Jersey, and as Alan's mentioned, in Maryland, the Catholics originally settled that with high levels of toleration. Now, many people don't realize eventually the Anglicans took over there and actually did create a combination of church and state. It's really Pennsylvania is the only colony that was settled, other than Rhode Island, the only other colony that's settled. And Pennsylvania, if you remember your American history and the Revolution, Philadelphia is essentially the capital of colonial America. It's where the Revolutionary Congress is held, the Declaration of Independence, the constitutional conventions are held there. And it is in Pennsylvania where there is a separation of church and state in a principled matter, and the state is commercially successful, right? People are kind of unsure about this wild place called Rhode Island in the north, where there's Quakers and atheists and Native Americans, and the economy there is not huge. But in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia rapidly becomes the most prosperous and largest city, and it's shown that separation of church and state can go hand in hand with commercial flourishing. And it's in good part because of the religious toleration, because Huguenots and Moravians and Catholics and Anabaptists and the immigration is just very great because of the toleration. That gives them people, it gives them workers, and it makes their economy a success. And people see for the first time that separating church and state doesn't undermine society. It can actually create a stronger society. And this is really the beginning of the American experiment.
Your emphasis on how the commercial success of Pennsylvania contributed to validating separation of church and state, I have to bring in a modern day parallel, because if there is a part of the world that we think of as being the most hostile to religious freedom and separation of church and state, it is the Arab world, the Middle East. And yet, I understand from those who are working on these issues there, our colleague Brian Grimm, that some of the emirates have staked their commercial future on being a place that welcomes Jews and Christians and Hindus and people of all faiths into a place that is, historically staunchly Muslim. And that there is a measure of religious freedom in some of the emirates. And I'm forgetting which ones exactly, but I think that's a development worth keeping an eye on.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And I think you just find where there's a pluralism and you allow the different ethnicities and religions to contribute, it's going to help build your community. And so religious freedom and appreciating diversity is not only the right thing to do from a principle perspective, but it also turns out to be a helpful and useful thing to do just from a secular state and society building perspective.
So chapter 6, Nick, you really develop the story of how the colonies went from having established churches in some form or another throughout all of the colonies within roughly a 50-year period from the 1770s, Massachusetts being the latest to disestablish in 1833, how it was that we didn't just adopt a formal disestablishment as a matter of the federal constitution, but each of the states disestablished. And I know you cited there the work of our colleague, law professor Carl Especk, who's done even more work since the book was published on and published on the disestablishment of the states and the influence that Protestantism had on that. Talk about that for a few minutes, and we'll keep an eye on the clock because we're not going to go.
We just have 4 or 5 minutes left here, and we want to hear from some of our listeners as well. Many Americans think that the First Amendment, which guarantees our religious freedom and the separation of church and state, was the thing that caused church and state to become separate in America. And there's some truth to that, but it didn't cause it at the beginning. If you remember your First Amendment, it actually begins, "Congress shall make no law regarding the
respecting the establishment of religion
or prohibiting the
free exercise
thereof." But it's directed at Congress. And that means that the states at the very beginning were allowed to establish religions if they wanted to. So in 1789 and 1791, when the Bill of Rights is it only stops the federal government from establishing religion. And many states continue, at least in Puritan New England and some in the South, to establish that religion. And so some have used this argument. Some Christian evangelicals today say, well, our founders believed that the state should be able to establish churches. And it was only against the national federal religion. But that's really to misread history, because the founders not only believed that this principle applied to the federal government, but that it should also apply to state governments. And as you noted, it only took a couple of decades for all the state governments to remove any state established churches from in their territories. And there were 1 or 2 states, Massachusetts, as you've noted, the heart of Puritan New England, held out to about 1831 or 33, and it was disestablished there. But it was, in some ways, the fact that it wasn't disestablished by the federal constitution shows the widespread understanding of this important principle, because all the states did it at the popular level of their own accord, because Americans who were not left-wing secularists anti-religious. Most people were quite religious at that point, but their religious principles taught them that the best thing for religion was for church and state to be separated. And that's what they did, not imposed by the federal government, but accepted by the common people throughout all the colonies, all the states, and every single one by 1833. So that's the story.
And you're
Yeah, but what's
suggesting.
unique,
Go
I was
ahead.
gonna
Yeah, Edward?
say, usually federalism didn't happen the Federalist way. From a federalistic standpoint, states came to agree that it would be best if we all followed the same track. And that was kind of very interesting to me, especially with this debate that we're having with regards to voting rights. There's an issue that should be left up to the states. You have legislation in Congress that's saying no, it should be something that should take place nationally. But here, with regards to religion, they've came over this 50-year period to say that this is the best thing for us as a whole, but yet they did that through individual states. I found that striking. I found it unusual, but also that cooler heads prevailed. And it just seems like we're so bent today on states' rights that we're not even looking for compromises on things that could benefit the whole on a national level, especially when it comes to voting. But that was kind of the compare and contrast that I saw, in terms of what's happening in contemporary times, that the states, after 50 years, they came to a solution that was actually a national one. It just came about in a different way.
Well, Ed, it's since you kind of frame it that way, I think it's worth noting that the underlying issue in the balance of power between the federal government and states' rights has always been race. That it was there at the beginning, was the compromise over the role of the states and the right of the states to maintain their laws regarding slavery and the economic interests there. And ultimately, the Constitution was amended at the time of the Civil War to shift that balance away from the states, at least on paper, to protect all of our rights and liberties as a matter of federal law, including the right to vote, which, of course, the whole issue of race has continued through the following century up until the civil rights era and the various laws passed in the 1950s and 60s. But it's present today, as you mentioned, with ongoing controversies over, is Congress going to regulate voting? Are the states going to regulate voting? And so many other issues that we face today. There clearly is this underlying, challenge of race that is part of that tension.
Well,
but with the First Amendment, by the time we got to the Civil War amendments, it was clear that all of those protections were supposed to now be national.
So very good. This is a good segue, Alan, into our discussion from 2 weeks' time. This question that was left at the state level was eventually federalized after the Civil War amendments, and then Supreme Court interpretation does apply the First Amendment to the states, and it does apply civil rights about race and gender also at the federal level to the states. And most of us think that that was a good and appropriate thing. But next week, we're going to read the chapter about just before the Civil War and two conceptions of liberty, right? The people in the South didn't want to frame this in terms of freedom versus slavery. They wanted to frame it in terms of their economic freedoms. Mm-hmm. And they didn't just say to own people as property, but their economic freedoms versus the aggression of the North. And in a sense, it was economic freedoms versus personal freedoms and racial freedoms and human civil right freedoms. And I think that war continues even to today, where some people are arguing for free market democracies at the expense of almost anything else. And we have deep in our history that we should learn from the fact that economic freedom, if allowed to go too far, can be deeply abusive of people, and certainly were before the Civil War. And we're going to look at that chapter and then look at some of the myths about the separation of church and state, chapters 8 and 9, and maybe we'll get into chapter 10. So we've kind of come to the end of our time here. Maybe, Alan, you can, well, why don't you see if there are any of our listeners who want to ask questions aloud, or we've invited them to type them into the chat, but we can certainly.
We're going to stop recording, and then we can take some questions.
Yes. Okay. So thank you for tuning in this week. We'll meet in 2 weeks' time. That will be on April. What is that, Alan?
25th.
April 25th. That's right.
Is it
Thank
really
you,
on April
Edward.
25th? We might have to, we'll talk about that. That's my anniversary.
I see. All right. We will maybe send out an update on that then, but chapters 8 through 10. So thank you for signing in, and many will be watching this in recording, and you can find it on our Lake Union Religious Liberty Facebook page. So thank you and good night, everyone. And we can end the Facebook Live.